Imagine waking up every morning with a rumbling stomach, a back that feels like it fought a war overnight, and a king who thinks your pain is God's will. Welcome to the fabulous life of a French peasant in the 1700s. You're not living, you're surviving, and barely that. Imagine a life where you wake up each day, not to hope, not to ambition, but to survival. The year is 1788. You live in a small wooden hut if you're lucky. Your roof leaks when it rains, and your floor is not really a floor, but dirt. No insulation, no windows that shut properly, and definitely no time to complain. You're a peasant in France, and your only job is to stay alive long enough to work again tomorrow. Now, don't misunderstand. You are not lazy. In fact, you work harder than almost anyone else in the entire kingdom. The problem is, no one seems to notice or care. You rise with the sun, not because you're inspired by its beauty, but because that's when the plow needs pulling. And since your only cow died last winter, you've been pulling it yourself. Your diet, bread, if there's any, maybe a little porridge, some cabbage if it didn't rot. Meat only if something dies on the road and you fast enough to grab it before the dogs. You eat what you can, when you can. And when there's nothing left, you tighten your belt and tell your stomach to pretend. Spoiler, it doesn't. This isn't some isolated tragedy. You're not the unlucky one. You are the average one. You, and about 80% of France's population, live in what they call the third estate. Sounds fancy. Isn't this just a polite way of saying workers, farmers, and anyone else who wasn't born into wealth or robes? The first estate, it's the clergy. They talk to God. The second estate, the nobles. They talk to the king. The third estate, you talk to the soil with your hands, back, and broken dreams. Taxes, yes, let's talk about that lovely invention. You pay taxes to the king. You pay taxes to the church. You pay taxes to the local noble. And just when you think you've paid everyone, you get a new tax. On salt, on bread, on being alive. Meanwhile, the people collecting these taxes, they don't pay any themselves. That's the perk of being born on the right side of society. They eat kakor, or more realistically, they eat 12-course meals served on silver while you beg for moldy crusts. Speaking of Marie Antoinette, let's clear something up. She probably never said let them eat cake, but it doesn't really matter. What mattered was how believable it sounded, because that sentence captured the level of detachment that the rich had from the suffering below. When the people couldn't afford bread, the upper class didn't try to understand, they just threw a party of family. They're big, not because you wanted that many kids, but because half of them don't survive. You've already buried two. One died in the winter too cold, too hungry. The other from disease. The local doctor only works for those who can pay. So, you used herbs and prayers. They didn't work. Education, cute idea. Reading and writing are luxuries for children who don't have to carry buckets of water or herd goats before they even grow adult teeth. If you know how to sign your name, you're considered smart. If you can read a Bible, you're a genius. But here's the strange part despite all this. You don't exactly hate your life. You hate your conditions. Yes, but you love your children. You love the one cow that survived. You sing songs while working the fields. You find joy in small moments. Fresh bread from the oven, the sound of rain hitting the roof, and the kindness of a neighbor who shares a bowl of soup. You have faith, or at least the idea of it. It's the only thing left when everything else is taken. Still, something has changed in the air. You don't know exactly what it is, but you feel it. Whispers travel faster than carriages these days. In the village square, someone read aloud from a pamphlet that said men are born free and equal. Big words, strange words, dangerous words. You've heard about some people gathering in Paris, angry about bread prices. You've heard about books, illegal ones, that talk about rights and revolution. You don't know what a revolution truly means, but you know it sounds better than this. And you're not alone. Across the country, peasants are getting restless. They're tired of starvation, tired of watching their children suffer, tired of working until their bones crack while others lounge in silk and wine. The king says it's God's will. The nobles say it's tradition. The priest says suffering brings you closer to heaven, but none of them have dirt under their fingernails. Then came the winter of 1788, one of the coldest in memory. Crops failed. Prices shot up. Bread was more expensive than wages. You saw a man beaten for stealing a loaf. He didn't even run. He just stood there, holding it. It was for his child. That's when something inside you started to shift. You didn't know it yet, but it was the beginning of the end. For centuries, peasants like you had carried France on your back, and now that back was breaking. But before the guillotine, before the storming of the Bastille, before the world knew the names of Robespierre, there was this quiet suffering in forgotten villages. That's where revolutions begin. Not in royal courts, but in empty kitchens. Because hunger speaks louder than laws, and when the bread runs out, so does patience. The cold winter faded, but the hunger didn't. The empty stomachs of the peasants weren't just aching, they were roaring. A silent scream that echoed through the dirt roads and tiny huts of rural France. Life was unbearable, but the world above still acted as if everything was fine. In May 1789, the king finally called a meeting the Estates General. It was supposed to be a grand political event, a chance to fix the problems of the kingdom. The First Estate, the Second Estate, and the Third Estate gathered at Versailles. Sounds promising, right? But no, the peasants' voices were drowned out faster than you could imagine. The nobles and clergy insisted on voting by estate, which meant each group got one vote, no matter how many people they represented. So, the tiny group of nobles and clergy basically had the power to ignore the majority millions of peasants. Imagine going to a big meeting to complain about starvation and taxes, and the people with all the power just laugh and say, "Nope, we're good." That was the reality. The Third Estate got frustrated, and rightly so. Then came the bold move. On June 17, 1789, the Third Estate declared itself the National Assembly, claiming to represent the real people of France. They pledged the famous tennis court oath. They would keep meeting until France had a constitution that respected their rights. For peasants, this was the first glimpse of hope. Maybe, just maybe, someone was finally fighting for the hungry, the poor, the forgotten. But the king, he wasn't having it. Louis XVI called troops to Versailles, hoping to scare the assembly into submission. Tensions grew, and rumors spread. People whispered about plots, betrayals, and conspiracies in the court. Now, let's zoom out a bit to Paris, a city swelling with desperate, angry people. Bread prices soared, jobs were scarce, streets were filthy and crowded. The city was a pressure cooker ready to blow. On July 14, 1789, that pressure exploded. The Bastille, a medieval fortress and prison, symbolized the king's power and oppression. To you and your fellow peasants, it was the dark heart of tyranny. So, when a crowd of Parisians marched to the Bastille demanding weapons and gunpowder, it wasn't just a protest, it was a declaration that the old rules were breaking. The fight to take the Bastille was bloody and chaotic. Soldiers and protesters clashed. The prison fell. The crowd cheered. The symbol of royal power was torn down, brick by brick. For peasants beyond Paris, news of the Bastille's fall spread like wildfire. It was the moment when fear turned into hope. If the mighty Bastille could fall, maybe the king's power wasn't absolute after all. But the revolution wasn't just about symbols. For peasants, it meant something far more urgent. Will there finally be food on the table? Will the crushing taxes end? Will their children live? The summer of 1789 saw what historians call the Great Fear. Rumors of noble plots to starve peasants or burn their homes sent villagers into panic. Peasants armed themselves, attacked manor houses, and destroyed documents that recorded their debts and taxes. It was a chaotic time when fear, anger, and desperation fueled violence. Imagine years of silence and suffering bursting out in fire and fury. This was no neat revolution. It was messy, frightening, and unpredictable. Meanwhile, the king and the nobility were scrambling to keep control. The National Assembly tried to calm things with reforms, but old habits die hard. Nobles fled France. The royal family's grip slipped. Yet, even as Paris and parts of the countryside burned with revolutionary zeal, many peasants were confused and scared. Was the revolution really for them? Or was it just the rich swapping places? The National Assembly abolished many feudal privileges in August 1789, like the lord's right to demand taxes and services from peasants. That was a big deal, something peasants had dreamed of for generations. For the first time, laws began to recognize their rights. But change was slow. Bread was still scarce. Taxes, although theoretically reduced, still weighed heavily. The new laws often sounded like promises in a fairy tale, far from the mud and sweat of peasant life. In Paris, revolutionaries debated loudly, drank wine, and outside the city, peasants labored in the same fields, battling hunger and disease. Then came the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, in August 1789, a document full of grand ideas about freedom, equality. The words were beautiful, like poetry. But for the average peasant, the reality was bitter. How could freedom fill an empty stomach? This contradiction, the lofty ideals versus the harsh reality, would haunt the revolution. Still, something had changed. Peasants now saw themselves as citizens, not just subjects. The revolution had given them a voice, even if it was small and shaky. But not everyone welcomed this new voice. The church, once a pillar of peasant life, was deeply entangled with the old regime. The civil constitution of the clergy in 1790 forced priests to swear loyalty to the revolution, splitting communities. Some priests refused, becoming enemies of the state. Peasants were torn between faith and politics. The revolution was no longer just about kings and taxes, it was about identity, loyalty, and survival. By 1791, the king tried to flee the country, but was caught. This betrayal shattered any remaining trust peasants had in the monarchy. War clouds gathered as Europe's monarchies declared France a threat. For peasants, this meant more hardship, soldiers recruiting their sons, fields left untended, and villagers fearing invasion. Still, peasants clung to hope. They believed the revolution could bring justice, peace, and an end to centuries of suffering. But the road ahead was dark and twisted. The revolution promised freedom but demanded sacrifice. And for peasants, those sacrifices were the hottest. The year is 1792, and things aren't looking any better. The king is no longer a mystery man sitting far away in Versailles. Now he's just a prisoner with bad timing and worse advisors. The monarchy is falling apart, and in its place, a lot of shouting and blood. For peasants, this was supposed to be the turning point. This was the moment they'd waited for, when the old world would burn and something better would rise from the ashes. But instead of peace, they got something else, and not the regular kind, like the harvest might fail or your child has a fever. No, this was a new fear, one that came from above, from within, from all sides, a fear that whispered, they could arrest you next, and if they do, you won't get a trial, just a sharp fall in a crowd that cheers. Let's rewind just a little. In 1792, the monarchy officially ended. France became a republic. The king, yes, Louis XVI himself, was put on trial and executed in January 1793. The queen, Marie Antoinette, followed in October, her once grand hair chopped down, her gowns replaced with peasant cloth, and her final ride wasn't in a golden carriage, but in a wooden cart headed for the guillotine. Did that make life better for the average peasant? Because with the king's head gone, power didn't go to the people. It went to committees and clubs and politicians with fast mouths and short patience. The most famous of them, Maximilian Robespierre, the soft-spoken sharp-eyed lawyer who believed in virtue but kept a guillotine handy, just in case. The revolution, once a symbol of hope, started devouring its own. People who had cheered the fall of the monarchy were now accused of not being revolutionary enough. Nobles, priests, merchants, even fellow revolutionaries. Anyone could be arrested, including peasants. Yes, the very people who were supposed to be liberated. Imagine this. You live in a village. You don't follow politics because you're too busy keeping your children alive. One day someone in your village reports you. Maybe you didn't take down that old crucifix. Maybe you said something like, I miss the old days, when bread was cheaper. Maybe your neighbor just doesn't like you. Next thing you know, you're dragged away. No time to explain. No chance to defend yourself. You're thrown into a dirty prison, barely fed. If you're lucky, you rot there. If you're not, you hear your name read aloud and know that the next time you see the sky, it'll be from the scaffold. Over 16,000 people were executed by guillotine during the Terror. Tens of thousands more died in prisons or were killed in uprisings. The cities were bloody. The countryside was terrified. But here's the worst part. For many peasants, the old enemies and the new enemies looked exactly the same. Powerful people with no idea how peasants lived. Robespierre spoke about liberty and equality. He talked about virtue, about saving the revolution. But his version of saving often meant eliminating. If your hunger made you angry, good. If your anger made you loud, dangerous. If your silence made you suspicious, gone. Some peasants joined the revolutionary army. Others resisted. In places like the rebellion broke out. Not because peasants wanted to protect kings, but because they didn't trust anyone anymore. They were forced into wars, taxed by a new government, and threatened by a blade that claimed to speak for justice. In the thousands of peasants were killed by revolutionary forces. Entire villages were burned. Men, women, children, all punished for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And what about food? Still scarce. Harvests still struggled. And while some reforms had been made, like ending noble privileges, the daily life of a peasant was still backbreaking and uncertain. You could be free, sure, but freedom doesn't fill your stomach. Prices soared. Inflation turned every coin into a joke. Bread, that eternal symbol of survival, became harder to get than ever. The government tried fixing prices, punishing hoarders, blaming shopkeepers. But the real issue wasn't greed. It was that there simply wasn't enough. So what does a peasant do? You keep working. You keep digging. You bury another child. You pray. Not to the Republic, but maybe in secret, to the old God, hoping he still listens. Meanwhile, the guillotine worked overtime in Paris. Entire carts of people were brought every day. Some were criminals, some were heroes, and most were just unlucky. It became a public event. Vendors sold snacks while people cheered or wept. What did peasants think of it? Mostly they were just confused, scared, tired. Robespierre kept insisting that the terror was necessary. A painful step toward a just society, but it didn't feel just. It felt cold, ruthless, familiar. In July 1794, Robespierre himself was arrested and executed. Yes, by the same guillotine he used so freely. The terror ended not with a victory, but with a shrug. A new government formed. New leaders took power. Same chairs, different names. For the peasants, still no land, still no bread, still the same burden. Many were disillusioned. They had marched, they had hoped, they had watched kings fall and heads roll, but their lives, deep in the fields and forests, remained soaked in sweat and silence. That was the real tragedy. Not that the revolution failed completely, but that the people who needed it most never truly got it. They weren't asking for gold, just bread, a roof, peace, and maybe just once, a life that didn't feel like a punishment. The year was 1794, and the blade finally slowed. Robespierre, once the symbol of revolutionary virtue, was dragged to the guillotine with his jaw shattered and his eyes wild. The man who had spoken of liberty with perfect posture was now another head in a basket. Paris, once soaked in red, began to dry slowly, awkwardly, and with the kind of silence that only follows too much screaming. For the peasants far from the capital, there were no cheers, no sense of victory, no feeling of closure. The terror had ended, but the trauma lingered like smoke after a fire. The fields were still dry, the stomachs still empty, and the future still unclear. The guillotine might have stopped for now, but nothing else seemed to move forward. With Robespierre gone, a new government took power. The Directory, 5 men sitting in Paris who claimed to represent the people, but to a peasant, they may as well have been marble statues. They spoke in the same grand language as the others before them, made the same promises, and offered the same distant smiles. But they didn't till the soil. They didn't know what it meant to sell your last spoon for flour or to bury your 3rd child under a nameless tree, because there was no money for a coffin. Life was supposed to get better now the king was gone. The nobles were gone. The priests had been silenced or run out. Wasn't this the reward? Weren't the peasants supposed to be free now? But the grain prices still climbed. The bread still vanished faster than it could be baked. The land, for the most part, still belonged to someone else. You didn't work for a noble anymore, but you still worked for someone. Or maybe worse, you worked for nothing. For survival. For another day. The Directory wanted stability. They wanted peace. They wanted the revolution to feel complete, like a story neatly tied with a ribbon. But the peasants didn't live inside books. They lived inside mud huts, in villages that still didn't have schools or roads or doctors. The revolution had rewritten laws, but it hadn't rewritten the weight on their shoulders. Some reforms stuck. Feudal dues were gone, officially at least. You no longer had to kneel before a lord or pay taxes and chickens. You were a citizen now, how no. But being called a citizen didn't change the fact that you still worked from sunrise to dusk, still feared the weather, still prayed that your back wouldn't give out before the harvest, and even the word citizen lost its shine after a while. During the revolution, it had meant something. It was supposed to mean dignity, equality, but now it was just a word painted on tavern walls, hollow and tired. The revolution's echo was loudest in Paris, but in the countryside it faded into whispers. The guillotine had become a thing of the past, but the fear remained. It lingered in conversations, in glances, in the heavy silence when someone asked too many questions. Everyone had lost someone, a friend who had said the wrong thing to the wrong person at the wrong time, and no one wanted to be next. In some regions, peasants had rebelled again, not against kings or nobles this time, but against the revolution itself. In the thousands of peasants and rural workers had risen up, tired of war, tired of priests being driven out, tired of being told what to believe and how to live by people who had never once dug a hole in dry soil. The revolution, which had begun in the name of the people, was now turning against them when they dared to disagree. And so the question remained, who was this all really for? The years dragged on. New wars were fought, this time with foreign powers. Austria, Prussia, Britain. France was now not just a country was a country at war with half of Europe. And peasants, as always, paid the price. Not with silver or land, I had none but with their sons. The revolution had promised bread, but gave uniforms. Promised peace, but delivered cannons. Promised liberty, but sent recruiters to every village square looking for bodies to fill ranks. Many peasants didn't even understand why they were fighting. What was freedom worth if it came wrapped in a death notice? Then, in 1799, everything shifted again. A man stepped into the spotlight. His name was Napoleon, a general with a sharp mind, a sharper sword, and an ego that could fill the Louvre twice. To the elites, he was a rising star. To the merchants, a savior. Too many peasants, just another man in a different hat. But Napoleon did something the others hadn't done in a long time. He brought a kind of order. He restructured the economy, stopped the constant revolts, and even brought the church back into daily life. Peasants, especially in deeply religious villages, found comfort in hearing church bells again. For years, religion had been treated like poison. Suddenly it was allowed, encouraged, normal again. Napoleon didn't promise to make everyone equal. He promised to make things work. And honestly, after a decade of chaos, many peasants were okay with that. The roads improved. Markets stabilized. Schooling, at least in theory, became more available even to the children of farmers. He introduced the civil code, a giant legal reform that, while not perfect, at least gave peasants some legal footing. There were no longer shadows in the system. Still, it would be naive to think that life became easy. Food was still a daily concern. Land was still unevenly owned. And war never left. Napoleon marched across Europe, dragging France behind him. Thousands of young men from rural villages went off to Italy, Egypt, Austria, and never came home. Mothers wept in silence. Fathers grew thin with worry. Yet compared to the terror, to the endless purges and midnight knocks, life under Napoleon felt almost calm. That calm came at a cost, of course. The dream of the Republic was replaced by an emperor, The promises of radical equality were replaced by medals, uniforms, and censored newspapers. But at least, in the eyes of many peasants, the world had stopped spinning so violently. And what about the revolution? What did it all mean, in the end? It meant that kings could bleed, that thrones could fall, that even the lowest born among us could dream of change. It meant that justice was a sword that cut both ways and sometimes too deep. It meant that the system had cracked open, even if it hadn't broken entirely. For the peasants, it wasn't a fairy tale. It wasn't a tragedy either. It was a slow, painful awakening. They hadn't gotten everything they were promised. In truth, they'd barely gotten scraps. But they had gotten something more permanent, something unshakable. It's a whisper at first, a murmur through the fields, a thought passed between neighbors. Maybe next time they wouldn't wait so long. Maybe next time they wouldn't carry the kingdom on their backs in silence. And that whisper became a memory, a warning, a seed. Because revolutions don't end with a guillotine. They end with someone remembering why it happened in the first place. They end with a farmer teaching his son to read, with a girl who decides her name matters, with a mother who says, no more. The French Revolution wasn't the end of peasants' suffering. It wasn't a magical fix, but it was a beginning. And for people who had spent centuries being nothing more than hands in the dirt, that was something. It was enough to keep going, enough to keep hoping, enough to believe that one day the land would belong to those who worked it.